got an automatic voice.
Consenting being recorded.
All right, you've not got a notification come up, right? Cool. So if anyone doesn't know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you?
So my name's Paul, and that's basically about it, mate. That's all you go.
Good night.
End the podcast. Appreciate it. I'll take it.
Sweet.
So yeah, my name's Paul. I work with a bunch of guys called the Muscle Mentors, which might sound a bit strange, but essentially we're a combination of two things: a coaching company and an education company. My role is much more educational, and we're probably best known for what's called mechanics, which is really just the physics of exercise, as it were. Like, what are the forces we're applying to you while you're doing things, and how do we manipulate those to create a better exercise experience or a more effective exercise experience for you, or if you're a coach, for your clients in front of you. But we also cover plenty of other things, from hypertrophy mechanisms to sleep, digestion, psychology, etc., etc. I've been a PT myself. I think this is my 11th year. I've been online for probably about 5 or 6 at this point. It does blur when you've been doing this a while as to when exactly you started. So I spent 6 years working in, a commercial gym, a David Lloyd. I spent some time in a gym box. I'm based over in London. Don't know how many of your people are over in Hong Kong, or who this goes out to, so maybe we'll point that out. I have a performing background. I went to drama school, of all things, before I became a PT and spent some years acting. And that's pretty much me, really, in terms of, for anyone who doesn't know me, that's a good a place to start without this going down a rabbit hole as we need to go.
I'm sure we'll go down a few of them. So with regards to how did you find the transition over to being mainly a coach to mainly an educator? Because everybody now, not to get you on one of your famous rants in the first 5 minutes, but everybody now wants to become an educator straight off their PT course. What moment did you feel you were ready to step into a more education role, and how have you found that process?
That is a good question. And the answer is, I don't know when I felt ready to start doing that. It's sort of a gradual process, I think. I don't know that it happens immediately. And if your role is educator, that's really quite broad. And I think the question becomes well, what are you sufficiently good at that you could actually impart knowledge that is useful to other people? And so, the realms that I find myself either in demand to teach about are mechanicsy things, the physics of exercise and fitnessy stuff, and in part that really came about because when I first started getting into the mechanics realm, I had a bunch of questions that couldn't be answered by any of the other mechanics teaching-y places, whether that was RTS or the hypertrophy coach or insert other person here. I wasn't finding answers to some of the questions I had about, but why is that this much different? Why is this weird thing called a moment arm decreasing as the force angle changes? And why isn't it linear? Right? And it turns out to answer those questions, you actually need to learn some physics, which means you need to learn some maths. So I went down a big rabbit hole, and I'm still down a rabbit hole in that regard to find answers to that, because there weren't any previously. And so when you go down a bit of a hole that no one is really going down before, it turns out people will start asking you questions when you start showing, oh, this is why, and this is how, and you can provide some answers that people weren't sure that they had for themselves. So that is arguably kind of part of it. And then psychology is probably the other aspect of that. And arguably that came about because in my own past, I suffered with OCD. I've worked with a whole bunch of people with disordered eating and eating disorder style things. I've got an ebook on that very topic because OCD and eating disorder share a lot in common from their psychopathology, right? How that thing manifests and progresses and sustains itself is very similar to OCD or addictive disorders. So those are the things that come about. I suspect as well that having a bit of a performing background adds a layer of ability to communicate that is probably missing from a lot of, let's call it, educators. Like, there's a lot of very intelligent people, and they learn this thing and they want to tell other people about it. But my friend Greg Slater, who works over at Lift the Bar, said it really well, that telling is not teaching. Like, just because you know something and you can say these words does not mean for a moment that the person hearing that has understood what the fuck you mean. And so trying to find ways to convey that information in a way that is received and understood by the person in front of you, that's a different skill than just understanding the stuff yourself. And it's weird because a lot of the exercise world wants to take itself as evidence-based, right? And become sciencey within stuff. And that's very cool. Except for the fact that people forget that teaching has a bunch of evidence behind it as well. And not all teaching methods are the same. And weirdly, no one who's part of the evidence-based crowd seems to have taken it upon themselves to discover what methods of teaching work best for teaching. And so there's a big disconnect for me there where you're like, okay, guys, if you value evidence in the way that you say you do, you should also, and you call yourself an educator, well, then you should educate yourself on the evidence of what the most effective ways to teaching are, or you're failing your own criteria by which you like to brag. And so I think there's a thing there.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at like the evidence-based crowd, Luke Lehman often says it best, where people, he doesn't call himself evidence-based, he calls himself evidence-informed, and not to like throw the evidence-based crowd under the bus, because there's a lot of them I really, really like Eric Hells and Andy Morgan is absolutely fantastic. But most people that use that term probably aren't even coaching informed, let alone evidence informed. Most of them are the people that have never set foot on a gym floor, and I think. But it's interesting you talk about sort of like it being a gradual process, because I found that when I was one of those people that came out and was inspired by Phil Leaney and inspired by Charles Poliquin, and had this dream of sitting in front of an audience and listening to me talk about a topic, and you sort of forget about it over time, and like you just sort of get stuck into the process and stuck into the craft. And it was only when like I ended up there more than I ever actually tried to get there. It's like it's just like a natural progression over time.
Yeah, it's probably the same part of us that always imagines ourselves as the hero in the story, right? We're the person saving the child. I'm Oscar Schindler, right? Whenever we see a thing, we've got this little fantastical part of our brain that's like, I could be the rock star. I'll be the person on stage. I'll get the Oscar. Like there's a part of our brains that just sort of automatically admires that and then places ourselves somewhat in that position. And so perhaps we've got this thing of people like, oh, I want to do that. It's like, yeah, but you only get to that point most of the time. There'll be some exceptions of people who are well connected or really good at networking or schmoozing or kissing ass or whatever it is that they kind of do. They tend not to last very long, though. If they get themselves that platform and it turns out they've got nothing worth saying, well, you get kind of caught out with that. So it comes down to that same stuff again of like, well, you're going to have to spend a shitload of time getting really good. Like, even if you took it from a different world, and whether that's a world based in science, and we want to listen to a Brian Cox or a Neil deGrasse Tyson, or people, as it turns out, with PhDs, who are also quite good at communicating, or even because we don't have to compare ourselves completely to PhDs, because I actually think sometimes that's the wrong model for our industry. Our industry would be better served, I think, with more of a apprenticeship, carpenter, plumber, electrician model for them. It's sort of some amalgamation of those things where, yes, we can be informed by science, but most of what we do is informed on the gym floor, interacting with people and clients, and taking some of the research data and interpreting how does that matter to this person in front of me with all their idiosyncrasies. It's not that we dismiss data, you'd be an idiot to do that thing. But your client is so uniquely them with all the stuff going on in their life that if you try and just shove them into this box because you read a study that said they needed exactly 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram, right? Yeah, okay, you can try that. But if you do that, you might forget to listen to Carol in front of you, who's telling you a whole bunch of stuff that means, well, this isn't going to work for her, or this isn't the place for us to focus yet, or whatever that thing is. I've forgotten where your question started and where I've gone with this.
That's good. One of the things I want to come back to there is this thing about being the hero in your own story. I think that's so important. It's something I always check myself out a little bit with as well. Like I say to my clients a lot that if this was a Harry Potter book, my client is Harry, I am Dumbledore. Like I am here to be the mentor and the guide, but this is your story. And I think it's often the same thing as coaches have to remind themselves when they're coaching their clients. Because
I really wanted you to be someone else like Neville Longbottom or Hagrid. You gave yourself Gandalf. That's a Gandalf, Hagrid. Oh, Jesus. My brain isn't working. Gave yourself Dumbledore. It's early over here, folks, for those listening.
Realistically, I am Neville Longbottom, but I'm putting myself in the coaches thing here.
He has a heroic moment.
Yeah, putting aside like briefcase wanker in between Simon for just like 2 seconds, and like making me a little bit more cool in my own story here. But it's, I think it's often people are. I found this early in my career. I so wanted to be impressive to a client or impressive to my Instagram following that I actually forgot of like, who am I trying to help here? I'm already thinking the next sentence ahead. I'm not actually listening to what they're telling me.
Yes. Yeah, and I think, look, I suspect some of that, or a lot of that, comes from the fact that deep down, when you first qualify, that there's so many things you don't know the answer to. And if you got really pressed on it, you'd be like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
And there's an insecurity inevitably with that. Like, I think we've become I don't want to say obsessed, but it's very common in the industry at the moment to hear about things like imposter syndrome, and that it's normal to have imposter syndrome, and therefore it's okay. And it's like, well, no, because at the start you are an imposter. Like, and every beginner is, because you're a beginner. So you can't be good at what you do. And no industry thinks that you should be fully qualified and great. No one imparts the word master to someone who qualified in a few months. Like, if you did that as an electrician, you'd be laughed at. You're like, no, there's a reason you're getting paid peanuts and this, that, and the other, and called an apprentice during that thing. Like, if you're a new trainer, there's so much you don't know yet. And I don't mean that to sound condescending, because it's just a reality. It was certainly true for me. It was definitely true. I was going to say it was definitely true for you, but that sounds worse than I meant that to. But it's true. It's true for all of us. Everyone starts pretty much roughly at the same point, and when you get let out amongst things, you're gonna need to get better. And part of the way you do that is you look for people to admire and follow and learn from and all that kind of stuff. And you then want to be impressive and seen as those things, in part because you want to see yourself in that light, and you don't yet. And so that's why you kind of admire that thing and aim at that thing. And I don't think there's a way of getting around it. I think you kind of have to embrace that part of the process. And for me, the first couple of years of your career, you're not going to earn as much money as you think you're going to earn. And it's going to be a struggle, and you're going to have lots of doubts. I think the industry average, by the way, for someone qualifying as a PT to never doing it again is something like 18 months. And that's skewed by like me and you who've been doing it for a decade plus or kind of whatever. So there are people clearly in there who've qualified, spent a couple of grand to do this, been excited, and then burnt out in less than a year. And in part, that's false expectation, what have you. In part because there's no good roadmap. In part because most of the commercial gyms are shite and don't have a way of improving their trainers, and they're short-sighted, whether that's a David Lloyd or a Virgin or whoever. Like, there's so many trainers they can get back in that it doesn't matter if they burn through these ones. But that's going to be a problem for them and their penetration rates long term, because you're hiring people who aren't very good, which means they don't provide a great service, which means the client who hired them doesn't see the value in PT longer term, which means they don't recommend it. They're less likely to get another one in the future. That devalues everyone who's wearing the same shirt as that person who delivered that experience. And you're like, okay, if you're those companies, yeah, you might have to accept we're going to need to pay our PTs more, or we're not going to keep the good ones. And we're going to have to train them up to a high level. And that's actually where companies like UP and stuff do a good job in at least the initial few years of they really accelerate that process, because there is more of an apprenticeship almost style model where you have to meet a couple of times a week and you are taught things and walk through stuff. There's lots of criticisms you can make still of those types of companies as well. But if you compare them as a starting point for a PT to a David Lloyd, where I spent 6 years, there's a big difference in the ethos and the culture of the place within that. And actually, I think that is a good place to start for most trainers. If you can get into somewhere like that, it's going to save you a lot of money, because otherwise you're going to have to go and spend that money yourself to get a good mentor, to accelerate your own process so that you can then be good at what you do and then make more money and then have a comfortable life and feel like you're making a difference and do whatever those things are that are important to you.
I think with looking back at my years at UP, and I think one of the things that was very good, is even not so much necessarily the education itself, but the creating that sort of system and that structure. So it's not what you learn, but it's like almost like, okay, here's a framework, get really, really, really good at the framework, and then you can sort of layer on education on top of it in a similar way that it's starting to client off in a meal plan, which everyone seems to hate nowadays and seems to be my rant of the year. It doesn't teach you anything, where actually that's the starting point. You can layer on understanding what macros are. And I think that's why when I look at the education system, a lot of this is, I don't want to say backward, but when I look at the education, the fitness industry, it's a lot of people trying to sound smart, where they'll give you like 20 weeks of deep science, which you need to know first, otherwise you can't understand actually how to execute the exercises in the gym. I'm like, by the time you've got to the gym bit, the person's so shut off and so bored. Yeah. And this brings back to where the you using toys becomes really, really good. And like how did that start with you and doing that?
Same thing. Like when you read mechanics stuff, you're reading physics phrases and you're reading sometimes equations. And if you don't come from a background of that, which I don't, that doesn't mean that much to you. But I was like, okay, but I accept that physics describes the world around me and seems to work because, the building I live in is standing. We seem to have launched rockets into space. Planes fly. Okay, I get that this is probably built on a pretty solid, thoroughly empirically tested foundation. Well, if that's the case, then I should be able to explore these things tangibly, hands-on. And so I wanted to learn more and see it. Like most of us, I think, when we're talking about stuff that sounds abstract, we do way better if you just show it, demonstrate it, get a bit of mechano out. I bought a crap load of mechano and these things called Engino, which are like, they're aimed at 8 to 15-year-olds and they're awesome. And I bought ones on cams and cranks and gears and pulleys and a whole bunch of different stuff that I could then build and then go, okay, these guys keep talking about a 2-to-1 pulley, a 4-to-1 pulley, a 1. What the fuck are those? And what does that have to do with anything? And okay, you can read that, well, a 2-to-1 pulley allows you to go twice the distance the load goes. And so the load doesn't accelerate as much as you do. And then, okay, what does that mean, right? And it's not until you put that on like a force, like a dynamometer, or I use a mini crane scale or a luggage scale you can get off Amazon for $5. And then you put it on a dumbbell and you move the dumbbell at a certain speed and you see the force needle move quite a lot relative to the speed it's traveling at. And then you put it on a 4-to-1 pulley system with the same load on it, you go through the same speed and the force needle doesn't move anywhere near as much. So the force on a 4-to-1 pulley system seems to stay more consistent on me as I pull it because of this pulley mechanism that you can then go into the nerdy bits with. But that initial curiosity moment, those things are awesome for teaching stuff. Like, as you kind of say, we almost want to show those things, like use a meal plan to begin with. Just get the client in the damn hamstring curl and do one before you start tailing them about their hamstrings or this, that, and the other. It's like, they don't know why that matters yet. Give them an experience that at least evokes some curiosity, and then you can lead off into the nerdy shit if they need to know the nerdy shit, or they're curious about that, or they want to know the details. But without that initial, well, why does this matter moment, like the rest doesn't matter. It's not about what you know again. It's not about what you can tell them. It's about what they take from it. If we want to be client-centered, and if you want a successful business, I'd encourage you to be client-centered. Well, then it's about what they take from it, not what you're saying. And so you've got to check with them. Are they interested in this? Do they care? Ask them. Do you care? Do you want to know why? Some clients will say yes. Others couldn't give two shits. And they're just there for a training session and cool, they want to get beat up, or they want to feel better, or they want their shoulder to stop hurting, or whatever their goal is. Some of those clients want to know the details, others don't, they just want the outcome. Okay, well, either way, I've got to get them the outcome, but then the detaily stuff in between is going to be filled in. Yeah, but to go back to the question, I wanted to experience those things for myself. I felt like I didn't understand them well enough yet. I had like a vague sense of them, but that seeing it and doing it and testing it, tying a balloon to a bit of mechano to mimic a muscle and pulling it at different angles around an axis. I was like, oh, I can see what this force angle of a pec means. And as that angle approaches 90 degrees, oh, it does create more rotation. And then as I pull it to 0 degrees, oh, it doesn't create any rotation. Oh, okay, there's a thing here. And you can see that immediately when you do it. You don't necessarily know why yet, but that doesn't matter, because the fact that you've gone, ooh, that's interesting, that's the fuel you need to want to go down the path of why. but you've got to get that bit first, I think. So that personally for me was why I went down there.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's why a lot of your stuff really resonates with me, in the sense when I started working with trainers and educating trainers, it's like people struggle with anatomy a lot because they don't understand the Latin words, and just going through an anatomy textbook and just going through endless anatomy before you have the right to get a leg curl, like no one cares. But imagine you get, I use a leg curl a lot because it's a really easy one to manipulate someone, but like moving the pelvis, getting them into a counter force, and then they're like, wow, I've never felt my hamstrings cramp like that. And now going back and telling them why, they're like, oh, that's interesting. I can visualize that. And like looking back at the moments where I started getting interested in this sort of stuff, it was those sort of aha moments. Like I remember, I think it was either a how to kettlebell or how to TRX course, one of the Virgin Active Essentials, because you need to learn how to use a Viper, otherwise there's no point.
Yeah, I remember those. Yeah. How to swing around, you do multi-directional lungey stuff while swinging this.
Yeah.
For those who don't know a Viper, do they still make them?
They must do. They
look like a bazooka with handles.
I looked more like, like gladiators. Like this is what I want.
Yeah.
Two things, like the two biggest uses I found for a Viper was one, playing gladiators when you're knocking people off the podiums, off Bosu balls. And then the other one was using a medicine ball and 8 of them to play skittles in the middle of the gym floor.
Oh, I've done both of those things.
Yeah, of course. I think everyone has that idea. I remember a guy called Dean Zweck, he was really smart, who ran these courses. And he'd done a lot of the Douglas Heel BAT. So for people that don't know this, it's Douglas is a South African like osteo-physio who does a lot of sort of like manual release stuff mixed with meridian lines and like stuff that hurts a lot but seems to get crazy good results. And I remember doing like the first thing I remember is he came in and he says, who can't touch the toes? Which of course is me. And I went up to the front and he released my masseter, which if this is a muscle on the jaw for people who don't know, which is horrendously painful. But then all of a sudden I could touch my toes in seconds. And I was like, I want to know why that worked. Why did he touch my jaw? And now I can move through my hip. And I remember a few years later doing that course. And then there was one guy on there. If I didn't chat to the guy beforehand, I swear I would have thought he was a plant. He comes in with glasses on and he's blind in one eye. So he comes up and he starts like poking around at his serratus anterior. And he realized every time he was getting close to his blind spot, he'd flinch and it'd get more painful. So we just slowly worked into it, got closer and closer and let him get more comfortable there. And then he got off and he went, I can start to see blurry things in the eye. I'm not even joking. And he comes in the next day without his glasses on. To this day, I do not know what happened. To this day, I still don't know. But eventually, I'm going to do enough like delving into anatomy to work out why that happened.
Nothing on that one.
Some fascial line stuff, something. There's something that
this is some Darren Brown shit where he's just like, this is a dude.
that is like, of course, other than yourself, that is my bucket list podcast moment, is getting Darren Brown onto this. And I will ask him that question just for you. So what was your moment? Go on.
Have you ever seen Darren Brown live?
Yes, 100%. I do hard magic as a hobby. I have definitely seen Darren Brown live.
Oh, really? Oh, do you? Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
I haven't done it in such a long time. I need to get back into it. But yeah, Darren Brown live is one of the best experiences I think I've ever seen. So good.
I still feel confused. I've seen him twice. I've no idea how he does anything.
I know the basic stuff, but then it's just mad.
Yeah, he's a wizard. I don't trust him. He should be drowned. Bring up Salem. I want the witch trials. This man isn't supposed to live.
He's the only person that's Harry Potter in his own story.
Yeah, 100%. So who's the hero in Darren Brown's story? It's Darren Brown.
yeah, exactly. So what was the moments in your early career that got you initially excited about all this sort of stuff?
Which sort of stuff? Because in my early career, I wasn't excited about this sort of stuff because I didn't know it was a thing.
What got you in, like, the first thing that made you like think, and learning about anatomy is cool, or learning about mechanics is cool? There must have been that aha sort of exciting moment for you.
So the mechanics thing, I was probably like 8 years in and was on a course that sort of almost started. And this is Michael Goulden and Integra for those who don't know. And I think he asked, why is a lat raise hardest when your arm is straight out to the side than down by your side? And I was like, I don't know. And 8 years in, I was like, that strikes me as a failing. Because it's not like during those 8 years, I hadn't spent money and time going to, you mentioned Eric Helms's courses and, you know, subscribing to Alan Aragon's research review back when you were allowed to do that. People would judge you. Or going to Brad Schoenfeld's seminars, or, you know, you go back before there, you mentioned Poliquin and all those, like, we've done all these things. And I was like, I still don't know the answer to that question. I was like, well, because it self-evidently is to anyone who's done a lat raise that, oh yeah, I can't hold my arm straight out to the side for anywhere near the length of time that I can hold it down by my side. So, well, did the dumbbell get heavier? No, the dumbbell probably didn't seem to get heavier, and that I didn't hold a 10 kilo dumbbell by my side. And then when I took my arm out to the side, it was a 25 kilo one by magic. It didn't do that. Okay, there's maybe the weight of my limb, but that doesn't strike me as being all that much, and like, I can do these things. And that annoyed me so much that I didn't know the answer to that. And that, okay, we could answer it with this thing called a moment arm, and that really what your joints are dealing with is a turning force that has this name called torque. And really the only time anyone's ever come across torque before is that something to do with a car engine, right? And like, was it horsepower? I don't know. Right? And so we get this thing that torque, the turning force, is about two things. It's a force, which, okay, so that's a force is like the dumbbell plus gravity acting on it. So weight, your weight, how much you weigh is a force. It's your mass in total kilos interacting with the gravitational pull of the earth, pushes on a scale. That's a force. If something shoves up and you start going upwards, that force changes. But it's that plus this distance, and that's the thing with the lat raise. When my arm is way out to the side, that load is now a much greater distance from this axis, and it exerts a greater torque, because torque is equal to two things: force times this perpendicular distance, this thing called a moment arm. And they're both equally important, which means, you know, if I've got the total torque is 50 units of torque, well, I could get to 50 via, you know, 5 times 10, or I could get there via 25 times 2. As long as these two things balance out to 50, I could either increase the force, or I could increase the distance, or I could decrease the distance and increase the force. They can interact in a variety of different ways, and they'll add up to the same amount. And it's a bit like seeing a seesaw in your mind. You can balance a seesaw in a variety of ways. If you've got like a big fat guy one side of the seesaw and you wanted to balance him with a small child, you could. You just have to move the small child a lot further out on the seesaw until she gets into equilibrium and balances the guy out. And that's the same exact process. That's the same principle at play. So that question, that course, and those experiences certainly what opened my eyes down this. And that's actually one of the first things I'd spent in years that actually got me excited about training again. Because, you know, I spent so many years, I think this is true of most people who become trainers, and it'd be interesting to see what you think on it, that when people first qualify, they think nutrition is way more complex and training's pretty straightforward. And in my experience, the longer you do this, the more you realize the reverse is true. That nutrition at its heart is not that complicated. Don't get me wrong, if you want to go into biochemical pathways and all that kind of stuff, it's complicated. But in terms of what my client has to do, it's not that complicated. You know, it reminds me of an old Bruce Lee line. I think it's a Bruce Lee line. It's like when I first started doing martial arts, he was like, I first learned that a punch was just a punch. And then I learned a bit more and I realized that a punch was not just a punch. And then years later, after a lot more learning, I realized that a punch was just a punch. And I was like, yeah, that's generally the way a lot of this stuff goes. You learn this basic, but you're like, okay, I know what that is. Then you get a couple of questions that you realize you can't solve, and like this whole world of stuff opens up in front of you. Like, oh my God, there's so much to know, Jesus. And then you learn a bit more, you get a bit more confident, and actually you come back to this thing of like, well, how do I apply it? What do I do with this? Oh, it's not that complex in terms of what I do with Carol on the gym floor again. And so I spent a good few years going down the nutrition side or the psychology side, because I was like, training, once you've gone, okay, well, the meta-analysis stuff seems to show I need to train a muscle group 2 to 3 times per week with, you know, 8 to 20 or 12 to 20 sets across the kind of week as it goes, with maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of my volume. If the aim is hypertrophy, coming from like a 6 to 15 rep range, and that leaves me with 1/3 to 1/4 left over for heavy stuff or high rep stuff. Yeah, I get it. I read the meta-analysis too, right? There wasn't much else. The only other things that would give you something to use in the training field were like, oh, there's an EMG study. And so EMG found this versus this. And so that was it. And you were like reliant on EMG. You had no real idea why. You were just like, but the EMG says. So you would go on the EMG and you go on a meta-analysis, and that's all you could really tell about training, because you had no other tools to analyze it or know what was going on, or even know what questions to ask. And so, all right, well, I can do that. That's pretty straightforward. Now it's sort of the end of it for almost years. And that's an insult to our industry and a failing of our industry that that's the case, because I can demo to you that isn't the case with some mechano. And that's been the fun part for me of exploring that. So yeah, that's kind of mine. So yours was on I haven't heard someone named Douglas Heel, by the way, in absolutely years. Like I remember that being PT on the net, possibly. I might have come across it.
Wow, that's a blast from the past. Yeah, that's a real blast from the past. Yeah, I think
that, or like T-Nation, maybe back in like 2011 or something. I think the last time, 2012, maybe last time I heard that name.
I think you hit the nail on the head with regards to how it switches between nutrition being the most complicated to training, because I think it's the same thing with when you get initial clients come in, that the thing they struggle with is nutrition. And you understand that for most people that come in to see you, their goal is changing their body composition. Changing nutrition is going to be the most determining factor. So you put your focus and your drive and your energy there. And yes, you can go down the biochemical route, and I've gone down that wormhole a fair amount. And like, yes, and that's complicated and that's interesting and it's nerdy, but with nutrition, the small, very basic things sort 90% of the nerdy stuff out. So like, unless someone comes to you with a real problem, then you don't really have to uncover that level of knowledge. With the training, you're going to meet people of all different shapes and sizes and preferences and goals and injuries and niggles far more commonly.
Yeah, loads more. I think there's I was just had to have a quick Google to remind myself of the name of this thing. It's called Brandolini's Abor, which is a funny name for this thing. But it's the amount of effort required to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude greater than it takes to just say the bullshit. So one of the reasons you end up needing to know a moderate amount about quite a few things isn't because it matters. It's because if you don't understand it, you can't dispute the fact that it doesn't fucking matter. And so that's one of the annoying parts of like when people, whether it's supplementation or, nutrient timing questions, which, maybe matters a small amount under certain circumstances. And there are definitely mechanisms at play that when you do this, this happens. Fair enough. But if you go and look at, well, what's the size of the effect that leads to in the people we apply this to? It's like fractionally small, frighteningly small effect for this intervention you've made that's cost 50 quid a month to take this random ass supplement no one's ever heard of, that only grows from a plant in the middle of Tibet, right? It's like, okay, I get that that's exciting, but how big of an effect does it yield? Not that much. Well, but this guy made this claim and said that it was magic and that I would change my entire life and melt the fat from my body. It's like, okay, unless you understand a reasonable number of things, it's hard to dispute that. It's still hard to dispute that. If someone comes along with some understanding of a biochemical pathway that I'm less familiar with and really wants to go deep on it, I can't follow them down that rabbit hole beyond a certain point. I'm like, I don't know enough to go with you here. I'd need a PhD to know whether you're just pulling that out your ass. But the bigger question of like, well, what difference does it make? What's the outcome that this leads to when that happens? And the short answer is not that much. It very rarely kind of changes almost anything. Like from a nutrition perspective, it is boring as it sounds about adherence, calorie balance, getting some plants in, protein intake. The rest, even if someone's trying to get shredded, doesn't matter anywhere near what people think that it matters. It just doesn't. And that sounds, well, but these guys want it so complicated. Yeah, I get it, but I promise you it doesn't. I've got enough results over the years to be like, yeah, these things seem to matter more than all those things.
I think social media can help with that as well, because when you look at nutrition, there's so many polarizing camps, probably more so in nutrition and training, although it's evening up quite quickly.
Getting that way.
The fact that people will say like the benefits of fasting or keto or high carb or getting someone up to 800 grams of carbs a day, and say, yeah, okay, that's cool, but people don't talk about what is similar with these things rather than what is different to these things. Intermittent fasting, keto, high carb, all of them do one thing very similar. If your goal is to get leaner, and it's controlled calorie balance and finding something that the client can adhere to, which is different for everyone.
Exactly. And it's not saying that, look, some people do feel better on a higher carb approach or a lower carb approach. No doubt. Some people just don't like having breakfast, in which case they don't have to have breakfast. Like, but to take that and go, well, that must apply to this person in front of me because I learned a little bit about autophagy. Like, no. Right? Like, we got the biggest thing with working with most clients who aren't professional bodybuilders, and this is still true of people who have got genetic freak capacity. You know, Cal, one of the guys I work with, for example, works with a lot of very high-end people. And still, when you talk to him about managing, you know, guys on a bunch of gear who are on like the high end of the genetic spectrum as well, and this is their livelihood and what they do, you're still having to manage their psychology about the approach that you take. It's like, okay, well, this guy freaks out if I don't give him a bit more free rein here, whereas this dude wants everything to the pissing letter and will follow it in a military style. It's like, both of these guys are high end, right? They're both people you'd all know, but they need to be managed in different ways. And it's about managing their personality, I would argue, much more than just the physiological approach you've taken. And obviously those two things interact. They're not completely separate from each other. Why this person feels better on this approach than that, it's hard to discern. Is it strictly physiological? Is it psychological? Is it a combination about their beliefs about the physiology? Because sometimes we do this thing where, you know, we learn a mechanism and then we feel we can explain the phenomena. It was like, okay, well, this is happening because the insulin hypothesis or whatever that happens to be, because we can create a story, a narrative around a mechanism that is internally coherent. It makes sense. It works as a narrative. But that doesn't make it correct just because something is internally coherent and you're like, oh, that kind of makes sense. Actually doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that it's persuasive and internally coherent. And so we can't make the mistake. Nassim Taleb calls it mistaking the map for the terrain. Like, don't be so busy staring at the map in front of you, you forget to look up and check that the map corresponds to reality. It's like, okay, I know you've learned this and I know that's persuasive to you, but that might not be the reason that worked, because there's lots of things we don't yet know. And just because we do know this thing doesn't mean that tells us the whole story. Meanwhile, reality is being what reality has always been. Your body is responding in the way that it's responding for sometimes who knows what reason. We can come up with a story that we feel is like, it's because of this. But I don't know definitively that there aren't these extra reasons that are also at play that we haven't yet discovered, certainly from things like a nutrition perspective and a physiology perspective, like that biochemical stuff. It's biblically complicated. For us to say, I know definitively that that is happening because of this, that gets squirrelier. Whereas I can say, we did this and this happened. Why it happened is open for a little bit more debate than people want to admit. But that's just the way that that goes. So, you know, we can't forget to look up and go, well, is this working for this person in front of me or not? And I can construct a bunch of stories as to why it's working for them, but I shouldn't be so confident that I definitively know them, because you probably don't.
I think that's an important message for sure, both the people looking to embark on a body transformation journey, as well as the coaches that might listen to this, in the sense of the coaches, for this understanding of that, like, you know, we've been in the industry a decade. The people that follow us, you know, you work with the Muscle Mentors. It's, you know, quite a big name now within the industry. I've worked with UP for 7 years and known for training trainers. We're still all making it up as we go along. We're still sort of doing a slightly more educated guess than we were 10 years ago. And when we go back to imposter syndrome, I think that becomes a big thing. It's like understanding that it's the imposter syndrome in you that pushed you to work out why that lateral raise didn't work. It's the reason why you're here. maybe not on this podcast, but here in the grander scheme of things. It's and understanding that, like, someone, a Luke Lehman, a Jordan Shallow, or whoever you see as the top of the tree in the industry, or Cal, for sake of argument, they'll have the same questions as you. They'll have the same frustrations with the clients as you do. And for the clients, it's understanding that it takes that pressure off. I need to do this because I need this to happen. Like, one of the biggest conversations I've had recently is with a lot of clients is that, your body weight is just the effect of gravity on you. You have no control, zero control over what your weight is tomorrow. Like, you cannot physically control that. But you can physically control what you put in your mouth, and you can physically control getting outside and doing your steps, even if it's raining. And I think that's like, when you realize that it's simpler and yet more complicated, than you could ever imagine. It takes that sort of pressure off, both ends, coach and client, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And look, a lot of these ones, if you're new and starting out, like, ask your client more questions than you think. Like, they have more answers about their life than you do in terms of what's gonna work as an approach for them, right? So now, that's not to say, obviously, you need to control for calorie balance. Let's keep it relatively straightforward. And in order for most people to adhere to it, they're probably going to want more than one meal a day. Okay, then maybe they don't want more than 8, because I don't know anyone who's eating 8 meals a day, right? But generally, most people do all right between 2 to 5 feedings, whether you call that a meal or a snack. Okay, and that within those 2 to 5, they need to control for their calories, and it's going to help with their hunger and satiety to get some protein in there, and they're going to feel a bit better if they don't eat like a complete arsehole across all of those meals. But most people also do a little bit better adding something they also enjoy eating in per day, whether that's factoring in some low-cal ice cream, or this client likes crisps, or this one wants that. Okay, you can have conversations and sit with them, and where we mentioned earlier, like a meal plan, I like the term meal template. And one of the things I tend to do with most clients is I will get them to just record their food intake for a day or two if they want a meal template. Because some people, depends who you work with, again, and I ask my clients, would you prefer an if it fits your macro style approach? And if they're familiar with that kind of thing, they'll be like, yeah, just hit me with my calories and macros and I'll make it work. Sweet. And some people prefer to be very clearly given what they need to go and do. Now, if you're working with, I have clients everywhere from India and Australia and America and all over the place. And it's hard to give an Indian client a beetroot salad recommendation if beetroot isn't anywhere near them, right? And so you can't be familiar with every culture's food preferences in the world, by the way. They are, though. So one thing you can do is get them to record for a couple of days, or even for a day, figure out what does that give them. Okay, so make sure they put the quantities in, because most people can do it for at least a day. Not everyone wants to track all the time, and that's absolutely fine, but they'll do it for a day. If you're like, what we're going to do is I'm going to get you to record that, and then we're going to tweak what you're doing so that we hit your calories, so that we hit your protein, so that you still like the sound of it, so that you can get the food from the shops that you go to, and yada, yada, yada. Or, okay, your wife cooks that meal, or you've got to have that one because you're living with your parents, or there's loads of idiosyncrasies about people's lives that we come back to, that we need to take into account if we're to provide them the client-centered service that we're saying that we're doing, that will help get them the result, that will then they'll feel more listened to, because they will be more listened to. They won't just feel like they're listened to. You're actually listening. You're not just dictating and going, do this because I said so. And you'll find some clients who are okay with that and want that approach, but they'll often tell you, they'll say things like, I'll do whatever you tell me. Which, by the way, even if they tell you that, isn't always true. There are some people who say they'll do whatever you tell you, and then they won't. And then there are people who will say they'll do whatever you tell them, and then they will do whatever you tell them. Those things are always ongoing dialogues. I've sort of given up over the years trying to guess which of my clients will do really well and which ones won't straight out of the gate, because I don't know. I've heard everything under the sun at this point. Some people who think they're going to be awful and like, I probably won't be able to stay, and end up doing awesomely. And some people who were like, this is everything to me, I'm going to fucking go, end up kind of getting nowhere. But circling it back with the food stuff, it's, write it all down, figure that out, tweak what they're doing, give that back to them. Okay, here's your meal template. You might want one day of that they're just going to repeat all the time while they get to grips with it for a couple of weeks. Or maybe they need a weekend one and a weekday one. Maybe they need a meal template across the week and they want to track macros on the weekend because they want a bit more freedom on the weekend. Maybe they want a meal template for breakfast and lunch. They're going to have the same things every day, but they want to be able to be a bit more flexible with their dinner. There's loads of options available to the person in front of you that still have to adhere to calorie balance and getting enough protein and all those things that are actually going to matter. But the only way that you're going to make that work for your client isn't reading a research paper. It's having a conversation with your fucking client and then going, all right, how do I give them this thing? And if you're a new client, listen to your client. If you're a new trainer, listen to your client or have that conversation. Sit down with them and make a plan that is genuinely tailored to them. And they'll appreciate you sitting down and taking that time. Like, right, we're not going to train for the first half an hour of this session. We're going to plan this out in a way that I feel like is exciting. And if I've sat down with clients before and given them the pen, right, you're writing this, I'm not. I'm here to help guide you while you come up with a plan. People do better when they have more autonomy in something and feel like they're coming up with it. And they'll ask you questions like, what do you think of that? Or like, oh, and because sometimes they'll give you things where they're like, I should write down salad, right? And they'll write these things down and you're like, really? Does that meal sound like you're going to stick to that? Yeah. Or are you just writing that because I'm here? And so you might need to reveal to them sometimes, you're like, me, I fucking love a donut. Like, I'm all on board with this, that, and the other. And they'll be like, oh, okay, maybe he's okay if I'm a bit more honest, because you need them to be honest. You can't coach things that people don't tell you. And so making them feel like you're not just the world's biggest judgmental ass who's going to bollock them every which way but Sunday for having one glass of wine or wanting to put a beer in or wanting to have some chocolate. Say, look, you are still there to hold them to account. So sometimes the industry has done this weird thing where you're like, we're not here to judge our clients. It's like, no, yes, you are. That's exactly what you're there to do. You're here to judge their execution of their technique so that it gets better. You're here to judge them in a way that helps them improve what they've told you they want to improve. You can't do that without no judgment. Teaching is about judgment. It's just, it comes from a place that cares about you, not a place that just wants to put you down and make you feel like shit. It's like, no, this is the standard. And I believe you're capable of that standard. So let's get you to it. And like, I want you to win with that. And if you make a mistake, that's okay. That's a chance for us to learn and adjust. That's information. That's feedback. That isn't stuff that we just go like, you're a dickhead. Although you will have a client occasionally that you can call a dickhead and they'll laugh, and that's the way to interact with them. So these are the things with all of this stuff. Is like, again, we'll keep looping back to this. There's evidence-based, which is fine, but that does not tell you how to interact with Steve in front of me over here and the fact he wants to get it on the weekend and also want to have some abs, or Carol with a couple of kids, or whoever this person is. And you can only do that by interacting with humans and not treating them as though they're a scientific paper.
Yeah,
shocking.
I think there's so many good points to unpack in that. I mean, and I agree with you in the terms of like not giving up of like knowing which clients are going to be good, because I found it's often for me the reverse of what you think it is. I remember when I first started in the career, and you see these people come in and they've got a bit of a belly, so you've got a bit of room to like make a good transformation. But you can see they're jacked and they're all in the right shape, so you know they can get very lean. You go, oh, why am I not getting these gift horses? And then you start working with some of those people as you get more experience. Those people I find that are 3/4 of the way there already are often the most difficult clients, because they don't wake up every day, look in the mirror and go, I hate this. It's like, I'm all right with how I look, but that's a lot of work. And I feel like when I motivate people, it's when someone starts, losing the first 10 kilos is really easy because they're being pushed away from somewhere they're miserable. And then you've got to change how you motivate them to pull them towards something exciting. And that's much easier once they've started in that position where it's a need, rather than that'd be quite nice.
But dude, the industry tells us that, people aren't motivated internally by things like shame and negative emotion. The negative emotion doesn't have a place to play in our psychology. And it's all about the positive shit, which is horse shit. Because I've never met a single client who ever changed relatively drastically and was happy about that change, for the record, who didn't start with, I really hated what I saw in the mirror. I hated how it made me feel. And I'd hit rock bottom, and I needed to hit that point before I had that change. I've never had one client.
Yeah, if we look at sort of like, all we need to do is look at research of people that have life-saving medication for things like cancer and things like this, and the success rates of actually taking those things. And these are people with massive incentive to do so. And then you're looking at, and that's with that incentive, how feeble the success rates are, let alone somebody who's
like 50%, by the way.
I really love
daily medication.
Yeah, and rather than people, I love the way I look, but I kind of like abs. It's much harder. So I made a name for myself in my career of getting people out in shape that had, in a way, no right being in shape. I remember, you know, and like I'm going to throw some names out here, but I'm not saying any of these people can't get results with anybody. But I remember, I remember, like, you come in, this supermodel looking, like, gorgeous blonde would walk in, and I remember this actually happened once. She just walked in. I walked up to the counter. I went, "Oh, you're here to see Luke, right?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, how did you know?" "Don't worry, have a seat. You'll be right with you." And because Luke is, he was my mentor when I first started. And Luke McGurk, listen to this. I'm going to throw way too many compliments his way. You know, that kind of person that he's naturally ridiculously handsome. He is. He builds muscle without trying. He stays relatively lean whilst eating ice cream. He's smart. People like him. He doesn't have to talk much to be charismatic. You know, when certainly people like me have to work hard to get people to
hate him already.
Yeah,
we can only
want to.
Hope that it's like a flea.
Yeah, and you hate him, but then you realise he's such a nice guy, you can't do it. But yeah, so he got them, and then we had a guy called Matt, you know, Australian guy who was like, not say in your face enough, but sort of like, you know, like typical Australian, straight to the point enough that he got these sort of like big, stocky, sort of aggressive alpha male-y type guys. And then you'd have somebody, I used to joke that someone used to come in, scoliotic, dragging their feet, diabetic needle in their arm, t-shirt saying "I heart veganism," you know, and I'm like, "You're here to see me, right? Okay, come in, have a sit down." And they were often the best clients because they had that drive and they had that sort of need. And I think a lot of it, unpacking some of the rest of what you're saying about like bringing as I've gone through, the more I've learned to bring my clients into this process as much as possible, the better response I get, rather than sort of dictating sort of anything, right?
Yeah, pretty exactly that. And I don't know when or why we stopped being afraid to acknowledge that sometimes people don't like the way they look, and we have to tell them, "Oh no, you should love the way you look, however you look." It's like, but that's not true. It's not reality, and it's not going to work long term. Look, we're a sexually selective species, which means one of the markers that affects sexual selection, shock horror, is appearance. And so you're going to care about your appearance. The fact that there is a subset of people who develop disordered eating and eating disorders, and I say this as someone who's written a book about disordered eating and eating disorders and managing the psychology of a person after they get very lean. I'm all too aware of that road and what that can lead to. But the fact that some people take a lot of these things too far and therefore become only their physique, and that is the only thing that matters to them. And so any threat to the loss of their physique is a threat to loss of their entire identity. The fact that that is true, and therefore these people need to develop values that are about more than just what they look like, because they are more than just what they look like. No one wants their gravestone to just read, "Have great abs and a phenomenal ass." Like, or at least I hope that's not what you want your gravestone to say. That's all true, but that doesn't mean that however you look will make you equally happy. It won't. It's not to say that however you look, you'll be just as healthy. The health at every size is a dumb statement for a movement, because, well, you can be so thin that you die of anorexia. Of all the mental health conditions, anorexia has the highest mortality rate. More people die of that thing per person who has it than anything else. It's a horrific illness. But you know, when I've entirely got off of my brain, where was I going with that bit?
I think we were talking about the body positivity movement and people.
Health every size. The fact you can be that small and die. Well, you just said at every size. Well, you can be too small and die. You can't be healthy and be dead, right? So, okay, you can't disagree with that part. Are we saying that you can't get too big, that it's unhealthy? And if it is such the case that you get so big that it's unhealthy and not good for you, and shock horror, you are less attractive to the average person. And I say average person because, look, some people want to fuck horses. There are weirdos out there who do a whole bunch of different stuff. The fact you can find someone who is into certain things isn't proof writ large that everything is just cultural conditioning and that there aren't some nature drives within here. I don't think we can be attracted to just anything. You're not attracted to triangles or the vague abstract concept of hope. You're attracted to human-shaped things within a certain subset. And if we're going to say that we're okay with things like homosexuality, because it's wrong of me to judge you for something you had no say in, something I believe in wholeheartedly, well then, if I had no say what I'm attracted to, how did I have a say that I was only attracted to this range of body shapes? And that actually, if you get too big or too small outside of that, I'm an asshole for thinking not everything is beautiful. So you don't get both. You don't get both. Either you think that people choose to be gay, or you don't choose what you're attracted to, which means it's not me being an asshole to say that you could be too big or too small for me to be attracted to you, and arguably for the majority of the population, because we're an evolved sexual species. I didn't choose to be attracted to human shapes. That's a consequence of millions of years of evolution interacting with my DNA and giving me a drive towards certain things. And if that's the case, then I don't believe it's the case that you can love how your body looks however it looks. And that seems to be borne out when you work with clients who get really large or quite large or whatever their thing is for them, and they really don't like what they see in the mirror. And it is that drive, because they recognize they're away from something that's valuable as a human being. How you look, shocking, it is something that's valuable as a human being. It's just not the only thing that should matter to you. Again, we'll drive that in. That when they move away from this, they feel like crap. And it's that drive towards getting back to looking a bit better and better. And that has positive effects on their life, either from a health perspective or how society treats them perspective or how people look at them perspective. And babies, by the way, spend more time looking at attractive faces than non-attractive faces. What are babies socially conditioned to be assholes? No, again, we've got some nature in us. That means these things aren't just things you can tell yourself to like. And by the way, if you tell yourself to love yourself however you look, does that not make you a narcissist? Are you supposed to love every facet of how you look? Like, no, you sound like an arsehole. I love the way I look. There's nothing wrong with me. You sound like a cunt, right? Let's not be that person. And so as this, and I think this is actually, by the way, why as people get closer to being happier with how they look, they're harder to motivate to change those last bits, because the sense of internal negativity isn't as high. They're not driven in the same way as when they were miles away from it. And that's, I think, you know, that's the last couple of pounds are the hardest to lose. Yeah, that's true, but it's not, it depends on how lean you want to get, but it's not always true physiologically. Now, if you're shredded, yeah, there's a physiological thing in there as well as a psychological thing. But I think for most of the general population people that you work with, who are just trying to look a bit better, they have no desire to be shredded. They just want to be pretty lean and feel good on a night out in a dress or whatever their thing is. It's like, well, the last few pounds are hardest to lose for them psychologically, because they've got to a point where they're like, I don't really want to have to give up the next few things that I'm going to have to give up to do this. I'm feeling quite confident. I'm feeling quite good. In which case, cool, your client got where they wanted to get. And that's absolutely fine and dandy. But yeah, it boggles my mind and annoys me slightly that we're so afraid of negative emotions. But they evolve for a reason. Like, what are you telling me? Nature made a mistake? Can you have pride without shame? I don't think you can. So and that's not to say that we should go around being assholes to like people who struggle with their weight or whatever. I'm absolutely not for like ringing a bell and being like, shame when someone's eating a burger. Fuck off. Like, that's obviously not what I mean. But the idea that it plays no role in behavior change. Like, how often are we hearing currently that shaming doesn't work to change behavior? And that's because in studies where people experience shame, they then tend to go and eat more rather than less. And therefore, shame doesn't change behavior, which is true in none of those studies. But the experience of shame isn't proof that what happened was enough to cause shame. Like, if I've got a bunch of seats on a plane or whatever I've kind of got going on, and someone is too big to fit in it, and therefore they experience shame, did the airline company shame them with the seat? I don't know that we can conclude that. No, the person experienced shame, but that wasn't due to shaming behavior. And again, so there's the obvious ones when people are cunts online and say horrific things to people that you're just like, Jesus, man, have a heart. But that's a far cry from saying that this person was shamed. Just because you experience shame doesn't mean you were shamed. They're two different things. And as someone who went through obsessive compulsive treatment, that's one of the tenets of CBT, that just because you perceive something doesn't make it true. And you have to go in with that thing. Perception is faulty. As a magician, you'll be very familiar that people's awareness and perception can be manipulated strongly by what you do and how you do things. So if we're teaching people to just accept that what they felt is an accurate reflection of reality without question, we're teaching them things that psychology itself, which is the bit that blows my mind, doesn't back up. No psychological treatment is built on that. It's just not. And so we put these things together and go, okay, how is it that my clients come to me and say that they had to get to this bit where they just really disliked what they were seeing and how they felt, and that they had to get to that rock bottom moment before they were ready to change? How is that the case? And it's also the case that the experience of shame tends to cause people to go and eat more rather than eat less. And well, the latter part is because uncomfortable feelings are often escaped through the use of pleasure. And food is pleasurable, as is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's why people use those things for the most part. They're escaping an uncomfortable sensation they find very difficult to tolerate. But both of those things are true. And so we can't say that shame never changes behavior. That's dumb. It goes against everything that we've experienced with clients. It also goes against language. To call someone shameless is not a compliment. It also goes against evolution. Are you saying we evolved this universal emotion that serves no purpose? Well, no, because evolution doesn't seem to have fucked up that badly, right? It seems like a thing that's driven cross-culturally. So how do we reconcile those things? I actually think that's difficult. And it then depends context dependent and some other stuff that is more nuanced. And social media is not a great place for nuance. But I think ultimately it's where we need to aim at if we're to raise the standard of our industry, rather than just parrot shit that we've heard other people say back without really trying to think about what are the consequences of that meaning.
I think as well, when we're looking at that, it's looking that if you being not happy with something, it's like people are often associating shame and not being happy with something and bettering themselves as interlinking things. Whereas I remember when I first met my fiancée, that one of the things she stuck out in her head on our first date was I was quite happily said on our first date, yeah, I hate my teeth, I don't like them. And just because I've come to terms that I'm okay with that I haven't got the best dental appearance. But at the same time, does it mean that I don't want to? Should I feel bad? Should I feel like I don't need to change them if I have the money to get veneers? Should I say that I don't need veneers? Because you wouldn't do this in any other field. You wouldn't say, no, you shouldn't go to school because you should be happy at any intelligence level. It's like the two things are sort of interdependent.
Well, it's just that these things often seem harsh as well, because you can't have a standard without judgment of all the things that fall short of that standard. Look, we just did it with a friend of yours, Mr. McGurk there, right? Attractive, successful, charming, just a bit of a wanker. We wanted to call him names because really all he's doing is shining a light on all the things that we feel we fall short of. So what are we supposed to do? Chop everyone down who gets above that thing? No, that's the wrong way of looking at the world. No, Messi shouldn't be allowed to play football because the wanker's too good at it. No, you can't have people who are great without, by definition, other people who aren't as good. And then what are you supposed to do with that information? Deny reality? Say, oh, do you know what, Paul? No, the acne scarring that you've got, it's not there. Or that acne is just as beautiful as not having acne. There's no pro-acne movement, right? And even if there was, I wouldn't believe them. As someone who had it, I'm like, I can try and tell myself that if I like, but I wouldn't mean it because I know it's not true. I know I'm lying to myself because it hurts. It hurts to have that shit skin and have to acknowledge that that is actually there. And because other people don't. It's fucking unfair. And it is unfair. What am I supposed to do about it? Change all of reality so that we pretend acne is beautiful? No, because that's not going to happen. It's just one of those bits where you go, okay, well, maybe I can't do anything about this right now, but I can do other things. That's what got me into training to begin with. I'm like, I got a bit fat and I was spotty. I was like, well, I can't seem to do anything about this spotty thing. So I could at least get my body into decent thing. Or maybe I can develop my mind, or I can become funnier, or I can do this or this and this. You can't be amazing at everything other than Mr. Luke McGurk, apparently.
You hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head there, talking about, that I remember going to a thing called the Waking Up Weekend, which is one of the best seminars I ever went to. It's like a non-profit thing. And it's what Tony Robbins originally started and led to him doing his thing. Right. And the lunchtime drill that they had is like, I want you to go up to somebody who you don't want to have lunch with. And I want you to go up to them and say, I want to have lunch with you. And at lunch, you've got to tell them why you didn't want to have lunch with them. And as you're looking around, you're talking, being a bit judgmental. And I'm looking at the guy sitting there thinking aliens exist. It's, flicking his hair, and you think things a bit odd. And I thought he's going to get the most, and he did. But so did I. And I was sitting there going, why am I so unpopular? Like, what's wrong with me? And you sit down with these people, and you realise, like, a lot of it was down to I was mid prep at the time, so like I was relatively lean and in shape. I'm loud naturally. I come across more confident than I am. So a lot of these people, the things they didn't like were just a representation of themselves and their things. And, when that breaks down, like, when we're looking at shameful things, it's like, okay, well, who are we actually shining the spotlight on? Are you shining the spotlight on is the person speaking to you the problem, or is the way you're interpreting that information?
Exactly. It's exactly that. And that isn't to say that the problem is therefore always your interpretation. Sometimes your interpretation is fine and actually probably a fair reflection of reality. Like if I see someone go up and spit in a person's face, and it's not because, who knows what would have had to happen for me to be like, that's fair, right? But let's assume it was just a stranger going up to someone and being a complete cock. You'd be like, well, no, that other person's interpretation of this stranger spitting on them and calling them names is a fair reflection that this person is an arsehole. That person who got spat in the face didn't need to do anything differently. They shouldn't have modified their behavior. They're okay. This is a reflection on that other person. But sometimes it's a reflection on you. We just did it with Luke, and I've got a friend, Rick, who's also the same. Good looking, talented, girlfriend's in fact, wife and mother of child now, like as a model. His dad's a lawyer for McDonald's. His family seem to have a house everywhere. Who's friends with like Prince Harry, if you Google it. And I was like, why can't, I hope he's hung like a flea. It's the first thing I remember thinking about this thing. Because, it's the tall poppy syndrome, right? There's a reason that's a common phrase. And it's the same thing. We feel inferior in relationship to these things. And we can interact with that perception in a variety of ways. We could interact with it and go, okay, well, let's chop them down. Or we could interact with it and be grateful that these awesome people who can do awesome things exist. And it's generally a reflection of our insecurity when we decide to do the former and be like, fuck it, bring them down. Like, you can use it funny because you can acknowledge that we all have a bit of that impulse. Because we do. We're not denying the impulse. It's what you choose to do after you've acknowledged you had that impulse. You're like, bastard, right? that is the thing that really starts to matter. And like, I don't know why we don't acknowledge that it's okay to aspire to something that we think is actually, no, this is more attractive. And I think it's because we're afraid to say this is more attractive, because that is a judgment on all those people who are not that. And it doesn't have to be, here's the thing, it doesn't have to be a judgment on their total being as a person. Like, you can be amazing in so many things and still flawed in others. Like, who isn't that? Like, who isn't, like, okay, the person with the greatest physique? Cool. They could be an asshole. They could also be lovely, by the way. And we often tend to do that thing where, like, bet they're an ass, just as we did a second ago with Luke, because again, it makes us feel a certain thing. We're like, I want to be that way. But instead of acknowledging that I want to be that way, I'll just shit on this person. That'll be fine. And because I think as a society, we've moved more and more towards this naive idea that be kind always, don't judge anything ever, is a virtue. And it's dumb because it's not possible, it's not useful, it's not helpful. You can't be kind always. First of all, it's not obvious what being kind always would even involve. Like, if I believe, let's say I was a religious person, I'm not, but let's assume that I was. And that according to the word of God, which is the holy word of God, doesn't matter that it was written down by humans before anyone starts protesting that point, that's obvious, but you're looking at it from the wrong lens. As far as this person sees it, this is holy, scriptural word given by a deity that is way more important than any human being. Fine. And let's say that their word, God's word, is that homosexuality is evil and that if you commit it, you will go to hell for eternity. Well, is it kind to stop your friend going to hell for eternity by stopping them having gay sex? Which one's kind in that instance? Well, the atheist is like, well, it's no, you should let them do, and it's not kind to tell them those things. But if you genuinely believe in an immortal soul and eternity, not getting laid for 80 years is easier than eternity of suffering, right? So which one's kind? You can't reconcile that with the stupid idea of just being kind always. And then what am I supposed to do if, again, that stranger comes and spits in my face? Be kind? What does that even mean at that point? Or someone who's, stabbed or raped someone. Like, you can come up with a gajillion examples of the awful things human beings do. And what are you supposed to do in those instances if your whole idea is we should just be kind or we shouldn't judge? Well, if we shouldn't judge, then I can't call the paedophile evil. I can't call the rapist evil. I can't call the murderer evil because I can't judge anything. I can't choose to eat, by the way, because eating is a choice. And so it's driven by an impulse, but that impulse says that eating is better than not eating because survival is better than not. That's a judgment. You can't make a move. I can't decide to drink this water without judging that water is necessary. It's the stupidest stuff. I'm like, how have we got here? How are people saying these things and nodding? And then we're all playing this game like, oh, look how smart we are. Like, no, you're fucking not. And it annoys me. So apparently I'm ranting.
No, rant, you're known for your rant, so I don't mind this. But bringing this sort of like, in a way, bringing this back to clients, but I'm sure this will go off on a little bit of another tangent. But obviously, like you very, bravely in a way opened up about going through a period of OCD. This is something that's very close to my heart with my fiance. Still suffering and going through this, about to go through this again with therapy. Right. Like with like the experiences you've had with your own mental health, with performance, with all things you've learned, like for people that have these sticking blocks or these things these views on perception, or even just people that are kidding themselves into feeling like, they don't need to change. What have you learned from your experiences that have helped clients break through some of these mental barriers that you found in whether it's changing the shape or just getting happier? I think
people don't generally do that well with advice. So whenever you often get asked, what advice would you give your younger self or a client listening or this, that, and the other? And the reality is that when we change for whatever reason, we change because something in us has started to see the world differently or decided to aim at something differently or is working towards that, and things are working to help us change and what have you. And the only way of starting to know what processes you should go down is through an accurate appraisal of where you are right now. So we want to know, where do you want to go? And we also want to know, where are you right now? And then you're trying to figure out a map between those 2 points. But how do I know where you are right now? I don't. And the only way I can get to know where you are right now, and perhaps the only way you can get to know where you are right now, is conversation and figuring that out and writing it down and exploring that. So one of the biggest things you learn through therapy and that sort of stuff is the importance of listening to the person and asking them questions and putting it on them rather than saying, here's what you need to do. How the fuck would I know what you need to do? I don't know what's going on in your life. I don't know what it's like yet. So, and that's really difficult, but it's the same stuff you'll see whether people want to read. Carl Rogers is really good to read for the sort of empathic listening to a client, because it's actually really hard to listen to a person genuinely and not do what we said earlier of wanting to jump in with your point. Like, I haven't spent this podcast truly listening to Simon as he's talked with this, because I've been like, oh, I'm being interviewed and I've got maybe things to say and I need to. That's a different thing going on than if I was really trying to listen to you and understand how you saw the world. Because there's this strange thing when people feel okay with the person who's in the room with them and they feel like this person does want the best for me and we're here to understand each other and kind of move forward. Maybe we can start to explore those thoughts and how you see the world. Because when you tell me, let's say did you say fiance? You guys are, yeah, you got engaged last year.
No, 3 months ago.
3 months. It's okay, yeah. It was during I remember it was during lockdown. Well, congrats again.
Thank you.
But did you say also OCD? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So, OCD is an umbrella, right? And it has different subsections. So there's things, one for those listening is called contamination OCD, which is the type where you might be convinced there's germs and bugs. And by the way, we're in a pandemic, so this will exacerbate it for a lot of people because there are those things, for the record. that you have to clean the surfaces and you have to make sure everything is okay, because if you don't, and someone you know were to get ill from those things, your conscience is going to beat yourself up until you die, because that's on you because you didn't do a good enough job at cleaning. And by the way, an obsession is something that you just can't stop thinking about. That's basically the definition of obsession, just keeps jumping into your head. And that has both positive and negative connotations. There are maybe positive obsessions. How do you get really good at something if you're not slightly obsessed with it? Compulsions, however, are anything you engage in that temporarily at least soothes your anxiety, or the anxiety that is caused by that thought that comes into your head. And so they did a study back in the 70s to go, well, are obsessive compulsive thoughts different in nature than normal thoughts, quote unquote? So they got a bunch of people with OCD and a bunch of people without OCD to, over the course of a week, write down all of the upsetting thoughts that jumped into their head. They jumbled up all the answers and they got the research to be like, pick the OCD ones, pick the crazy ones. And you can't tell whether something is an obsessive thought or something that leads to a compulsion just by the thought. People have the same types of thoughts, whether they're well or not. And that, like, I'm worried my girlfriend's going to cheat on me. I'm worried that this might happen, or this person might die, or I'm not good enough, or I'm unlovable, or whatever the thing is that plays on your mind. It's how long does the person spend dwelling on that thought afterwards? How big an emotive reaction do they have to that thought? How much meaning is attached? How much severity of emotion is attached? What's the frequency of those thoughts? Those are the things that demarcate the obsessive compulsive thing. But there's a thing you have to take from that, and that is that if normal people, quote unquote, have the same types of thoughts as OCD people, then being better from OCD does not mean never having those thoughts again. Because you can't be better than normal. Like, that's aiming at something that's impossible. Often we hear a talk about unrealistic expectations and the problems of unrealistic expectations. Those problems exist in therapy and getting better too. Like, if you expect being better to mean never having to deal with these thoughts again, that's not happening. You can't get to that point. So it has to be a lowering in the severity, a lowering in the frequency, reducing that a lot, but not ever getting to absolute zero. Because if you try and get that, any thought you have is proof that you're not better yet. And then you might worry about that, and you can see how that can spiral out. But so that's a little overview of OCD. So we've got that contamination stuff. There's a type called checking, where maybe I didn't lock the door, or did I not do this? And all the things that person might worry after that event, because it's not that event that they're really worried about. It's the implications of if they don't do that. That's what's going to be so intolerable. So it's called checking. And then there's another subset that's called pure O, or rumination OCD. And this is one of the types I had. I had a type called relationship OCD, which makes me a great catch, ladies and gents. And pure O doesn't have the standard outward manifestation of compulsions. I didn't feel the need to clean things or flick light switches or the usual stuff that people think of when they think of compulsions. But it would influence my behavior all the time. So it might be checking phones or looking for kind of messages, or maybe I'll be overly loving, because why would you cheat or want to leave someone if they're overly loving? Or maybe I could be a bit distant, because, well, then you'll notice there's something wrong. And if you notice there's something wrong, that'll change your behavior. And then I'll notice that you've noticed, and that'll make me feel better. Or there can be a whole bunch of different things that you do that interacts with your thoughts and your perceptions of what's going on, that are part of the compulsion, that temporarily soothe the anxiety, but they only temporarily soothe it, because the length of relief that they provide you when that happens decreases. So let's say the first time you do this thing, let's say you worried about contamination stuff. The first time you clean the surface, okay, I feel good, it's better now. But maybe after a couple of hours, like, yeah, but people have touched it now, so I need to kind of clean that down. And then next time, maybe instead of a couple of hours of relief, it only provides you 90 minutes of relief. And then it only provides you 60 minutes and 45 and 30. And your life slowly shrinks to only caring about the obsession, and everything else that matters to you is different. And that's actually the similar relationship to the eating disorders, right? You can see how that's a similar process and what goes on with that. So, if I was having, and I'm sure you've had plenty of conversations with this, and it's a really difficult one, because part of the treatment for OCD is slightly different to normal CBT treatment. In the normal CBT treatment, you keep things like thought diaries, you learn to challenge your thoughts, you learn about thought errors, you learn a whole bunch of processes, which are super useful for people to know and learn. The problem is in obsessive compulsive disorder, those same processes keep your focus on the thought. They keep giving credence to the idea that the thought matters, that there's something to it. There's a thing in OCD called theory A, theory B. Theory A is if the thing you're worried about is a genuine problem, then all of your actions make sense. If you're really worried that this surface right now is covered in Ebola or whatever you're worried that it might be covered in, then you have a moral imperative to clean the fucking thing, right? You would be failing as a human to not do that. So if the concern is genuine, all of your actions make sense. Theory B suggests, what if the problem isn't the thing you're worried about? What if the problem is actually how you react to that thought? And that the actual thing isn't any more or less likely than it ever was. Well, if that's the case, then everything you do only serves to exacerbate the thing. In which case, then we have a different type of treatment that starts being built upon that, of more mindfulness practice, more letting go of thoughts as they arrive and refocusing back on the present. But that's really hard to do because the thing you're trying to ignore is, you know, the mental equivalent of a tiger eating your skull. And it's really hard to ignore that and not engage with that. And then that person is going to want to talk to you about it because they're going to want reassurance and they're going to be really worried and they're going to be upset. And as the partner of that, that's going to be really hard for you to not engage in. But certainly for me, there's a good book called Living with a Black Dog. And there's a book called, or there's a second book called Living with Someone, Living with a Black Dog. It's something like that, which is about depression. But the sort of ideas are somewhat true. And for the people who were close to me during my treatment of stuff, we had to have a conversation with them of being like, right, I'm going to want to keep talking about this, but it's actually not good for me to keep talking about this because it keeps the focus, it keeps wiring in those neural pathways that are focused on this. It doesn't give them a chance to dissipate. It doesn't let me lay down different neural networks in response to this thought or worry that I have, which means I'm just going to keep circling the drain here. And so I had to have a conversation with people, and so did my therapist, of being like, right, if and when he wants to do this, and you want to do it compassionately, because it's hard for the person, otherwise it's certainly hard for the person to hear anyway, of being like, I know that you really want to talk about this. I know it's really hard for you. But we've got to keep in mind that if we do that, we're keeping focused on it. And long term, that's not going to help you move past this. It's not that I don't care. It's that I care and I don't want this to keep being your life. And it's really hard to do that to someone you care about who's crying, who's clearly deeply distressed. It's really hard as the person who's distressed to hear that and to not want to keep engaging with it. And we're like, fuck this person. They clearly don't care. And this, that, and the other. Like, these things are difficult. And if they were super simple and could be resolved on a podcast, then I'd be a billionaire and have a yacht. And they sort of can't, because we have to talk to her and listen to her and start to see, well, what's she got going on here? And then how do we formulate possibly a plan out of that? And then how do we navigate the rocky road back out of that process? And because it's going to, maybe she'll have a period of time where it's great and then it falls back a bit. And then, and you know, for me, it took the best part of, let's say, 18 months or so before I felt really kind of me again, from the start of it. And that's one of the realities. Now, I took more, bringing this back to coaching things, I took more from all of those experiences with regards to coaching people than any PT course. You know, I'm grateful for those experiences to a large degree because of the positives I was able to take from, because of how it changes how I interact with people now. But even having stories to tell like that generally makes people feel more comfortable opening up to you. And that's an important part of getting better. But it's also those same bits where you mean, like, my job isn't here to not judge you at all, because I want you to be better, and that's a judgment. Like, I'm on your, but I also acknowledge that just telling you to be better isn't going to make you better, right? So there's stuff to be navigated, but I don't think it's done by this idea of like, oh, we just don't judge anything. Like, well, that's not helpful.
I think going into like the CBT stuff and actually how these things start to, like, you build the foundations of getting better. It's and what I've learned is being supportive without being enabling. And when you're going through these things where you're having these conversations of reassurance, it's like, okay, where's this line between, okay, I want to be supportive of where you're at and having this empathy, but not being enabling to keep that thought in your head. And a lot of times, again, bringing this back from OCD down to coaching is, it's looking at what the association is. Oftentimes when someone is having a thought about something, it's not the thought. It's I feel I am anxious. I don't want to really, I can't deal with I'm not in control of what's actually making me anxious. So I'm now going to find some way of placing my anxiety. In a similar way to a client, who can't stop overeating on an evening. And is it that they're hungry? Maybe. Is it that they really, really like Snickers bars? Maybe. But it can quite easily be like, okay, is this something at work? Is this something that you do when you're stressed? And it's like Craig Ballantyne's comment, like, never make an important decision when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. It's like the Holt system.
Yeah.
And it's like, when you're looking at this, it's like, okay, before you sometimes, and you going through this, I'm sure will, as you said, allow you to be a better coach, because you now know it's not someone's really struggling, they're lonely, they're upset, they're angry, they're tired, and you're going, the first thing you do is every time is eat more broccoli. And the disconnect just starts.
The most reassuring food of all time.
Yeah. So how do you, and like going into coaching with this, from this experience, how do you start to approach these conversations if you have a client that you feel is having not not out of your remit therapy's level of emotional eating, but that have that eating for the stress, eating because they're lonely? How do you start?
It's in my check-in forms for people. So there's a whole psychology section in my check-in form. Now I have different check-in forms. Some people need that side of things and other people don't. And it's about adjusting and, again, providing the client what the client needs. But within those types of people, it's, okay, trying to understand, as you rightly said, what does this person eat in response to? Is it hunger? Is it emotional pain? Is it loneliness? Is it boredom? What is it? And often we can't know. So I have a food diary that's adapted from a thing called CBTE, or Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Enhanced, by Chris Fairburn. If anyone wants to check this out. And it's, you record a normal sort of food diary. What time was it? What did you eat? What did you have? But it also includes, okay, where were you? Who were you with? What were you thinking about? What were you feeling? And it also goes into other things like, was there any purge behavior, vomiting, laxative, diuretic use, that kind of thing? Is there anything else we should know? And let's say you keep that for a week. All we're looking for in the first week is patterns. Like, okay, this person, if they go 6 hours between meals, they make a bad choice. Well, there's a simple solution. Let's not go 6 hours, right? Could be one for that. Well, this person, when they feel unlovable, and by the way, it's worth ranking feelings out of 10, or ranking them out of something, because feeling hungry at a 4 out of 10, not the same experience as feeling hungry 9 out of 10. Okay, so the magnitude of the emotion matters as much as the emotion itself. Lots of us can tolerate.
With online, sorry to cut you off, but with online there, if you've got, let's say, a 4 out of 10 hunger, what you class as a 4 out of 10 hunger, what I class as 4 out of 10 hunger, and what a client class as 4 out of 10 hunger, is always going to be a little bit different. So then, when you're dealing with people that you don't see face to face, how do you uncover what, if they're really ranking this?
Yeah, so you can provide them. So I use a thing called the hunger scale. It's literally, you can Google the hunger scale, you'll find the same thing. So you can provide little markers for where that is, of like, okay, 10 out of 10 is post-Christmas dinner, you're in a food coma, cool. Naught is you're willing to eat a baby. And then you can fill in the markers kind of in between those points. And to some degree, it doesn't really matter if we're in exact agreement that my 4 is the same as your 4, because it's really about yours relative to you. Like, let's say that for you, you can't tolerate above a 6. I don't really care where the 6 is then. I just know that, all right, we want to avoid getting to a 6, or we need to increase your tolerance of getting to a 6 or being at a 6. And by the way, it will also vary. But let's say you can tolerate a 6 out of 10 hunger when you're well rested and stress is low. Those things may well change as those other things start to change. So just because you've kept it for a week doesn't mean you've got a definitive answer on these things. But so let's say you find, okay, it's when their hunger gets out of control. Okay, well, how do I control their hunger more? Pretty straightforward. Let's say though it's when they're bored. Okay, well, maybe I don't think I can solve their food problem with, their bored problem with food necessarily. So, well, do you have anything? What do you do for fun? Like, what makes you smile a day? What do you do there that's relaxing or refreshing for you? Like, when you come up with a to-do list for the day, do you put anything in there for you? that you just like doing for the sake of it? Like for me, for example, that might be playing music, playing a video game, whatever. Like, how often do you refresh yourself in that kind of way? What can you do when you're bored that isn't just turning to food and booze? And you'd be amazed the amount of people who don't have anything on that list. It always blows my mind. Okay, what about if they're lonely? That's a more common one than you might think, and it's hard for people to admit that sometimes. Okay, and it's also hard to solve sometimes, by the way. But it might be that they can start to look at, okay, well, could they ring their sister or a friend, or maybe they'll decide, instead of eating, I'll go for a walk when I feel that way, or I'll start a gratitude journal, or I'll look for reasons where I'm not, okay, am I ignoring the people who do care about me because I'm so consumed with feeling lonely that I forget to notice there are people who care about me? There's the point with any of this is the first bit, the diary keeping, is you're just looking for what are the patterns of behavior that lead my client to do X. Because unless you do that, unless we've gone through a proper analysis, we're just guessing at solutions, right? And we can do better than that. But the first bit comes with an assessment of where the person is before you start putting in more strategic and specific plans for, like, let's try this out. And then you go and try it for a week. And maybe you get lucky for a week because it turns out they didn't feel lonely this week once, in which case your strategies to solve loneliness, you can't tell whether they worked or not. Or maybe you can. So they're always in dialogue with each other. And again, there's those bits where you just have to have that conversation with your client. Because I mean, I remember having a client where, her husband had died, and so she drank too much wine in the evening. You think she doesn't know she drinks too much wine? You think I'm going to tell her that I can't believe you're just doing this, or like, you need to cut back on the wine? It's like, she fucking knows she's in pain. Like, maybe she's not going to change that bit for a while. In which case, maybe she's just healthier because she started exercising for the first time. Maybe that's positive enough right now for her. And who am I to tell her otherwise? I was 26 or something. This one was 43, and her husband had died after a couple of years of cancer treatment, or had killed himself. Like that, you're going to find stories that are heartbreaking at times. And if you think you can just sit there and be like, well, stick to your fucking broccoli, like, come on, man. But you'll only know that if you take an interest in your client and you actually listen to them. Again, we come back to that same stuff. It's not enough to be evidence-based, because that doesn't tell you anything about that person in front of you.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at sort of like stresses, whether they're emotional, like physical, whatever, internal, external stresses, one of the things I've learned as a coach, that more I was thinking of strategies. What can I do to alleviate the stress? What could you put in place to alleviate? And it's not that these strategies aren't useful, but oftentimes people, they overwhelm themselves, they create too many decisions in the day by trying to be the perfect wife or husband, the perfect father or mother, the perfect friend, the perfect employee, the perfect at the training, the perfect nutrition. And then you add a 400-page spreadsheet and a morning routine and an evening routine. And like now when I start speaking to people and I listen to their day, and I'm more trying to say, right, what can I take away from you here? Like, one of the things I think is so common is your inbox is not your to-do list. And how many people wake up and the first thing they do is check their email, and everything they have to do is urgent, because the people that are emailing you are in the same overwhelmed, stressed, angry, lonely state that you are. So they perceive this to be urgent, and they're putting this onto you, and then everyone just rises. And it's hard, because sometimes it's hard as a coach to sort of accept this, but sometimes people have to make the mistake enough before they realize there's this value to it. It's that person that gets into the job, gets fired, or they get in trouble, or they miss a deadline, for them to go, do you know what? This isn't worth it, and I need to take a step back. And you telling them they need to take a step back when you're, a 24, 25-year-old personal trainer that does 4 hours a day, and then sits listening to podcasts for the rest of the day. And it's the same thing I have with people that go out drinking every weekend when they say they want to diet. It's like, I used to be that guy. I used to drill them into the ground. But you look at this and you have these conversations, and it's like, sometimes, one, it's not my place to say where they want to be. And as long as our expectations are aligned, and my conversation is like trying to treat people like adults. And it's like, okay, this is what you need to do to hit this goal. I'm not compromising on this. And a lot of trainers don't understand what a compromise means, but you're not hitting this. So is there a way you can push up to here in the standard that we've set, that you set for yourself? Or do we need to refine the goal? And if they go, do you know what, actually beers with the boys on a Saturday is more important, then that's it until they change their mind, until something happens in their life that changes their priorities.
Dan John had a bit where, I don't know if you remember this, is like, do your behaviors match your goals? Is a good question. When people hear that and they go, oh, then I must change my behaviors. The other solution is you change your goals. Like, it's not always the case that you have to change your behaviors. You can change either. You can change a bit of both. You can, and that's what, you know, that word compromise you said. You're even compromising with yourself, because you can't aspire to all goals all of the time. To specify one goal is to say, I'm not going to do these others. Now, that doesn't mean you have to take them completely off the table, but they certainly change on the priority list. If you want to get shredded, that's not to say that you should therefore turn into a crap friend and colleague and whatever else you define yourself as.
Yeah.
But you should probably know that you've decided to put this one above the others for most of it. And that might come with some consequences. Or even that might be, okay, well, the consequences of that are, I'm not going to feel as energized as I could. I'm not going to feel as full as I could.
Yeah.
There are consequences to, and then if you decide I want to feel as full as I possibly can all the time, well, there are consequences to that too. So, and I think you're right in going, it's my job to make my client aware of the outcomes of whatever thing they want to do, and be like, right, here's what you said you want to do. Here's what's required for that goal. Do you still want to do it? And they might say yes, in which case you go after it. And then along the way, you find out, okay, well, they're not quite doing those things, in which case, all right, we've just got to bring it to their attention of like, okay, we did say we were after this, but you seem like these ones are still important to you, and because you keep doing them. In which case, if you want to get there, we're going to have to change some of these, because that might be required for that goal. Now, that requires an assessment, and some people think too many things are required to change to get to certain goals, and they're not always. But let's say that they are for the sake of this conversation, in which case then we go, okay, well, maybe we aim a bit lower than that in order for you to still do this one. Like, where are those? And they're an adult. They're allowed to make that choice. It's not for me to tell them that their goals are what their goals are. Like, that's for them. It's just for me to kind of reflect a little bit with them and go, okay, well, if you want to do this, you'll probably need to do this, this, and this. Is that something you want to do? Yeah, on it. And then they can change their mind as they go through that too.
And to sort of bring us back full circle into a sort of a little bit of a closing statement, I think going back and sort of coaches and how to sort of get the most from your clients in terms of coaching, it's understanding compromises with coaching as well when you're having these conversations with clients is, and going back to the thing you made at the start about, you have to know a certain level of knowledge to be able to claim what is necessary and what is bullshit. And I think a lot of trainers will use the word compromise of saying like, well, my client didn't want to do 10,000 steps, so we just did 4. I'm like, yeah, that's not a compromise. A compromise is they get what they want, you get what you want. It's not one person gets what they want and you just completely take away. And that just ends up with like trainers wanting to be their client's friend. And I'm not saying I want my clients to hate me, but there's no way to ruin a friendship with a client. Yeah, there's no way to ruin a friendship with a client, like making it feel like you've wasted their money. And, you know, and going into that thing of like, okay, we need to hit, let's say 1% per week that you set 1% goal. You need to do that. You need to hit this many steps, this much training. This is what you need to hit your nutrition targets. But how I get there is about, there's a million ways. I could intermittent fast. I could do 4 meals. I could do 7 meals. I could do low carb, high carb. But it's like, the compromise is like, I will find a way to make this as easy for you as possible, but as long as we hit the non-negotiables. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Go on. So is it?
Go.
No, I was just going to say, I was just noticing that we've gone on a lot of great topics here and gone on so many tangents, and I don't want to keep you for your whole day. But so obviously, like you've shown here that you can well versed in chatting about the psychological stuff, the mechanic stuff, the training stuff, and the nutrition stuff. So if anybody wants to know more about you and where to find you, where can they find you, and where do they get to know you?
Instagram, that's basically it. So if you look for Paul at the Muscle Mentors, Paul_the Muscle Mentors, you will find me. You could just put Paul Standell in, and you'll also find me on there. But yeah, basically Instagram is the main place I hang out. If you want to know more about these bits and pieces, we at the Muscle Mentors have an education portal, literally themusclementors.co.uk. Go there, you'll see there's a free trial, but we have courses on exercise mechanics and sleep and digestion and stress. I'm currently working on a psychology course for said portal as well, for these things. That one's more the view to, as we said, managing the psychology of someone after they've got very lean, to try to, and even as they're getting leaner, to try and minimize the risk of them developing an actual eating disorder in the process, because the number of people who do that is upsettingly high, and I don't think it needs to be that way. I wrote an ebook that's called The Almost Inevitable Problem of Anxiety and Dieting, or How to Not Fuck Yourself Up While Getting Very, Very Lean was its subtitle, for that exact kind of reason, that it's an almost inevitable problem, but it doesn't have to be inevitable. But yeah, Instagram, the website, they would be the places to come and find me. If you've got any questions, you can either email at paul@themusclementors.co.uk, or again, DM on Instagram, and I will endeavor to get back to you within a day.
Now, as every podcast always ends with that exact statement, I'm going to end with a couple of like sort of quickish fire questions, just to end on a bit of like take-home points. So, like, what did you feel is the biggest biggest mistakes new coaches make when trying to get results with their clients?
Dictating.
Okay, cool. What's the biggest mistake you feel clients make when they're trying to get themselves in the best shape of their life?
That would really vary on the client, but let's say they've never got in the best shape of their life before.
Yeah.
They have completely unrealistic expectations about how long it's going to take and what it's going to be like, which isn't their fault, because how are you supposed to know about things you've never done before?
Yes, yeah, and I said that's certainly true with guys that say end up like under a certain number, they self-sabotage because they don't want to see anything with a 6. Under 70, no go. Yeah, and you overestimate how much muscle they have because the fat arms they've got filling the t-shirts, and they underestimate how much body fat they've got, and they realize they need to be probably 10 kilos lighter than they think. Going back into your thing, what's the biggest mistake you think coaches make when they're trying to apply mechanics on the gym floor?
Overcomplicated language.
Oh, that's such a good answer. I
use a thesaurus when
I was
talking
waiting
to a
for 1 inch active range, but that's a much better answer. Just a client glazed over, not understanding it.
Yeah, even the phrase active range is like, again, you've got to pitch it to the client, and that will vary on the client, but it's not your job to demonstrate that you mouth fucked a thesaurus. It's to communicate with the client in a way the client understands.
And for any coach listening to this breaks down even further. Even before you get into the physics conversations, people go, squeeze your lats, squeeze your glutes. I'm like, bum, back, poke.
Yeah.
Like no one says, squeeze your teres major. Clients like, what's that?
And also, what does squeeze your lats mean? For those who are just listening, am I supposed to take my right hand and squeeze my left hand with it? Clients often don't know what any of what you just said means. Yeah. Name the muscle they don't know, and what on earth does squeezing it mean? Yes. So you're going to have to demonstrate all those things with them until they get it.
And the same point with coaches, when we talked before, that having to have that aha moment. It's like, put the client in an end position, they feel it. Oh, I get what that's supposed to feel like. Put them in a lengthened position. Oh, I feel it. And then they start to be aware. And then that goes back to the communication, whether they want to learn more. And last one, this is probably just more a personal one, because this is how I stumbled on your Instagram page. When is the next rant, and what is it on?
That's a good question. I actually don't know. I'm currently repurposing some older ones, but I have made notes on yesterday, which is probably why I slightly ranted on a couple of things earlier, on unconditional permission to eat and unconditional positive regard, which are psychological tropes that I think are full of shit. You haven't got unconditional anything. Like, unconditional means I could eat a baby. You're not giving yourself unconditional permission. Yeah. But that's extreme. It's like, no, you said unconditional. There are no conditions which you shouldn't be allowed to give yourself permission to do. It's like, well, there are real cannibals in the world. So if you've given yourself unconditional permission to eat, and I want to eat the flesh of a living human, I should be giving myself permission to do so. And it's like, no, you shouldn't. I want to eat magma. It's like, no, you shouldn't. Right? Like, much greater permission to eat, yes. For the people with disorder, it's massively greater permission to eat. unconditional, you're just bastardizing the word unconditional.
It's like the word cheat meal. It's you're cheating on what? This is not a sport.
Yeah, exactly.
You losing 10 pounds is not a professional sport. What are you cheating on?
Yeah, the rules of dieting, apparently.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think it's good to repurpose some of the old ones, especially now in the purple. But I got way too excited. I thought, oh, there's a new rant out, and then it's CrossFit. I'm like, as good as that old episode is, you know, watching Friends Series 2 for the second time isn't as good as the first one.
This is the thing. People were like, "This is your best work. This is a page." I was like, "I did this a year ago."
Awesome. Right, so, we'll let you get on. Let you get on with your rest of your day. But thank you very much for this chat. Been really, really good fun. There's been so many topics that it's going to take me a long time to actually come up with timestamps for this because we covered so much. But
sorry about that, dude.
No. This is exactly what I want. If I'm going to eventually challenge Brian Rose and Joe Rogan, I can't just have what a moment arm is for an hour. I can't do it. So this is good.
I mean, we can do that. Don't get me wrong, but
I will 100% get you on again. We're probably more likely to delve down that psychological route again. And Joe, I'll probably just do both. That sounds fun.
Yeah, that sounds more right.
Yeah, but thank you very much, man. Thanks everyone, and I will speak to you next time.